By July 1941, when an American-British-Dutch embargo on the sale to Japan of oil and other strategic items took full effect, the Japanese had, through long and laborious stockpiling, managed to accumulate 43 million barrels of oil, enough to wage war for a little more than 1 year. To Japanese planners, therefore, the strategic imperative was to seize with utmost speed the natural treasures of Borneo, Celebes, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, especially Java. Once this was accomplished, the Japanese could establish a defense perimeter in the hope that the Americans would soon prove unwilling or unable to wage a two-ocean war against both Germany and Japan, and would negotiate a peace in the Pacific, leaving the empire in possession of its precious new conquests, euphemistically called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In the minds of Admiral Yamamoto and his fellow strategists, this vision of swift expansion depended on the destruction of the United States Navy in the Pacific. To plot the ruin of that navy and to plan the seizure of Southeast Asia, about 40 of Japan's top Navy officers met in September 1941 for a 2-week conference at Tokyo's Naval War College. Much as their American counterparts had envisioned in Plan Orange, the Japanese officers foresaw that the Pacific conflict would be decided by a single great naval battle. But as a prelude to that historic clash of fleets and the Japanese drive to the south, Yamamoto conceived an idea that would attempt to tilt the odds heavily in Japan's favor. "Our best course of action," he declared, "is to deliver a knockout blow to the American fleet at the very start." He meant, of course, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which would, he hoped, so damage the American fleet that when it was later brought to battle, we can destroy it completely. In achieving that destruction, Japanese submarines would play a part. As the fighting arm of the Sixth Fleet, which consisted solely of submarines and their auxiliaries, Japanese fleet boats were organized into 3 frontline squadrons. Zenji Orita, an officer in Submarine Squadron 1, recalled, "Basic pre-war strategy centered around my squadrons advancing deep into enemy waters and keeping watch on his naval ports. Should he sally forth to attack the Japanese homeland, we were to attack him, then use our high surface speed of 23 knots to dash away and set up a second ambush for him, repeating this tactic until we were out of torpedoes. If in spite of the damage we did to his fleet, the enemy kept advancing toward Japan, our combined fleet would sortie to meet him with Submarine Squadron 2 and Submarine Squadron 3 screening far ahead of it. Those submarines would repeat the tactics of Submarine Squadron 1. Theoretically, by the time the enemy closed with our main body for the decisive sea battle admirals dream of, he would be so weakened that he could be crushed. Japan would win control of the Pacific Ocean." Implicit in this plan was a fact later explained by Mochitsura Hashimoto, who ended the war as one of Japan's few successful submarine captains. The Japanese policy was to use submarines primarily for attacking enemy naval forces, Hashimoto wrote. Merchant ships were legitimate targets only when there were no warships to be considered. In line with that thinking, submarine commanders were given a schedule for torpedo expenditure that was even more restrictive than the original American quota. Enemy battleships and aircraft carriers were worth the firing of all torpedoes. Cruisers rated 3 torpedoes, but a single torpedo had to suffice for destroyers and merchant vessels. While the American submariners honored their torpedo priorities mostly in the breach, the disciplined Japanese would stick to their policy long after it had demonstrably failed, and at no point would they turn their concentrated attention to merchant shipping, the natural prey of the submarine. In retrospect, a number of naval officers speculated on the reason for this blind or stubborn impracticality. Atsushi Oi of the Japanese Naval General Staff ventured to guess that maybe at the bottom of our naval tradition there was a problem of racial temperament. Compared with Europeans, Oi continued, the Japanese are generally said to be more impetuous and less tenacious. They preferred colourful and offensive fighting. The picture of a fleet action is colourful. In any case, the Japanese submariners never thought in terms of a slow war of attrition against commerce. They went to war single-mindedly determined to send United States warships to the Pacific floor with all possible haste, and for this task they were thoroughly trained. Submarine officers were graduates of the Naval Academy at Etajima, which modelled itself so closely after Great Britain's Dartmouth that bricks for the buildings had been imported from England, along with a lock of Admiral Horatio Nelson's hair. On active duty, the ensigns served until they rose to the rank of lieutenant junior grade before they could apply for submarine service. Then came 2 years aboard submarines. After this stint, they were sent to specialized service schools ashore for 6-month courses in torpedoes, navigation, communications, diesel engines, and electrical engineering, followed by another 4 months of instruction in submarine diving techniques. Finally, if after 3 to 5 years they had proved themselves worthy, they might be sent to a school for submarine commanders. Enlisted men were selected from the various service schools, torpedo, gunnery, engines, and there was never a dearth of candidates. Crewmen and officers alike received an extra 30% in pay, and even in peacetime service on submarines counted double when figuring retirement benefits. Physical qualifications were strict, with special emphasis placed on keen eyesight and good hearing. Like the Americans, the recruits underwent psychological tests for their capacity to function efficiently over long periods in confined space. Then, after 6 months of submarine school, they were assigned to boats. Even before the war, training exercises were made as realistic as possible, regardless of the risk of accident. Indeed, during the 20 months before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese lost 3 submarines, 2 in collisions and another during fleet maneuvers. The accidents, a submarine captain wrote later, were due to the rigors of intensive training that was standard policy. Tough as it already was, the training schedule was stepped up between June and August of 1941 as submarines maneuvered vigorously from the bleak Kuriles to such tropical islands as Truk. And in exercises that would have horrified the United States Navy's cost-conscious Bureau of Ordnance, each Japanese submarine was permitted to fire a live Model 95 torpedo against the steep shores of Oshima, a desolate island south of Tokyo Bay. That torpedo was a Paragon, adapted for submarines from the Model 93, which was fired from surface ships and was to become famed as the Long Lance. The Model 95 could travel at 49 knots for a staggering distance of nearly 11 miles, leaving no telltale wake. It packed an explosive charge of 1,000 pounds, almost twice that of American torpedoes. It detonated on impact, with none of the troubles the Americans had with their magnetic exploder. The torpedo's secret lay in its propulsion system. It was driven by oxygen. This gas, with which the Japanese had been experimenting since the 1920s, made a treacherous propellant. The British had tried oxygen and discarded it because of its nasty habit of exploding without apparent provocation. But Japanese designers had discovered that the problem lay in the twists and turns of fuel lines leading from the oxygen tank to the combustion chamber, and in rough spots that formed pockets inside the fuel lines. When the angles were too sharp, oxygen massed at the turns and in the pockets. This built up pressure in the lines, thereby increasing temperatures and causing explosions. The Japanese solution was simple, at least in concept. We redesigned the fuel lines into smooth curves, eliminating all sharp angles, explained Captain Sadaharu Otsuka, a Navy torpedo specialist. Also, during torpedo assembly, we cleaned the lines with a potassium compound to eliminate all oil and grease. Finally, to overcome the chance of oxygen still massing when an engine was first started, we used compressed air to start the torpedoes, and introduced oxygen only after the cycle was open. All that remained was to handle each torpedo with care and respect. From their other equipment, Japanese submariners received mixed performances. Their optical gear was of superior quality, a fact somewhat muddled by a folkloric debate in which Americans held that Japanese had naturally poor vision, and the Japanese insisted that brown eyes could see better at night. It made no difference. The lookouts of Japanese submarines were expert by any standard, and they were certainly helped by their excellent binoculars. Japanese underwater listening apparatus was adequate, with an echo-ranging feature more or less accurate up to 3,400 yards and hydrophones that could give bearings at more than 5,400 yards. But in other areas of electronics, the Japanese began the war significantly behind the Americans, and as the conflict continued, the gap would widen. Most notably, Japan had a deficiency in radar that was disastrous. Plagued by an inability to develop a high-powered transmitting tube whose centimeter microwaves tracked enemy ships accurately, the Japanese Navy entered the war without radar of any sort. Surface warships received their first crude radar apparatus only after the Battle of Midway in June 1942. And not until almost 2 years afterward would Japanese submariners, despite much beseeching, get radar. The submarine crews in the forward areas, recalled Mochitsura Hashimoto, were longing for radar as farmers look for rain in a long drought. In our despair, we were almost driven to the view that a single radar set would be of more value than 100 submarines. In that, the submariners may have been right, for in the most basic item of all, the boats themselves, Japanese quality was questionable. Perhaps the most dispassionate appraisal came later from a German admiral named Paul Wenneker, who served throughout the war as his country's naval attaché in Tokyo. The Japanese, Wenneker said succinctly, had poor types of submarines in this war. At the outbreak of the war, Japan's submarine force was numerically a shade larger than the American strength of 56 boats assigned to the Pacific. But of Japan's 60 submarines, 14 were obsolete RO, or second-line boats comparable to the American S-boats, incapable of diving more than 245 feet and usable only in coastal waters. Although all the others were designated I-class or first line, they varied greatly in size and purpose. 4, for example, were mine layers. Because of their special construction, they were dangerously unwieldy, tending to sink if at all overloaded and to pop to the surface when lightened. They were known throughout the service as the dreaded submarines. The backbone of the Japanese undersea force lay in these versatile I-class fleet boats. They displaced from 1,600 to 2,200 tons, carried up to 20 torpedoes, had a maximum range of 16,000 miles and top speeds of more than 20 knots on the surface and 7 to 9 knots underwater. On the average, they were slightly larger and faster than the American fleet boats and much harder to handle when submerged. They were also handicapped with needlessly complicated control systems, and they vibrated excessively, thereby making underwater noises that could be and often were disastrous. Nevertheless, these I-boats were Japan's best, and 27 of them figured in plans for the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. That fateful mission would also engage 5 boats of another secret type, the midget submarine. The inspiration for the miniature boats had come from a Japanese submarine officer who had seen a rudimentary one-man submersible used by fishermen, presumably to search for good fishing grounds. Various types of midgets were developed, the first in 1934. The model produced for the Pearl Harbor attack was a 2-man, 2-torpedo version, 78.5 feet long. This peculiar little vessel was driven by a 600-horsepower electric motor whose storage batteries could not be recharged once the midget was weaned from her mother boat. The midget could travel 55 minutes on the surface at a top speed of 23 knots or 19 knots submerged. By drastically cutting speed, the crew could extend her range to approximately 100 miles. In the original attack plan, several midgets were to be carried aboard a converted seaplane tender sailing with the combined fleet. As the fleet entered battle, the undersized boats would be launched and, with their low susceptibility to detection, bustle about in the midst of the melee, mystifying the enemy warships and doing them harm. But as the moment for war approached, midget enthusiasts importuned the commanders of the Imperial Navy for a chance at greater glory. Why, they asked, could not several midgets be carried aboard regular fleet submarines, then be let loose to penetrate and wreak havoc in the enemy anchorages? Most particularly, why could they not participate gloriously in the Pearl Harbor attack? The scheme went all the way to Admiral Yamamoto, who questioned it, partly out of fear that premature attacks by the midgets might warn the Americans of the main strikes by carrier aircraft. Yamamoto also thought that the proposed midget venture smacked of a self-annihilating mission, a measure for which Japan was as yet unready. Finally, under continuing pressure from the midget advocates, Yamamoto acquiesced, but only after receiving promises that every attempt would be made to retrieve the little vanguard boats and their crews. Detailed arrangements were made for the midgets' post-attack rendezvous with the mother submarines that would carry them piggyback to the threshold of Pearl Harbor and then carry them home. Thus, a scant 6 weeks before they actually set out on the long trek to Hawaiian waters, round-the-clock work began on the 5 I-boats that were to carry the midgets, secured by heavy clamps to their pressure hulls. The specific nature and purpose of that work was kept secret from the I-boat skippers and even from their squadron commander. They were told only that their submarines were being given special fittings. With these belated amendments, the submarines' role in the Pearl Harbor attack finally gelled, and the boats themselves got underway. 27 fleet I-boats, 11 of them carrying small reconnaissance float planes, slipped out of the Kura and Yokosuka naval bases between November 10th and 21st, 1941. Each boat carried provisions for 90 days. Except for the diesel engine room, all available interior deck space was covered to a depth of 2 feet by bags of rice and containers of other foods. To get from one place to another, the men walked on top of the foodstuffs. On the night of November 18, 5 more I-boats left Kure, each carrying a midget abaft her conning tower. This was a so-called special attack unit. While the Japanese Navy was on its way to a smashing victory, its undersea complement was heading for a dismal reverse that would, for much of the war, cast a pall over the entire submarine force. The journey toward Pearl Harbor started out well enough for the midgets. The mother boats travelled in line abreast at 20-mile intervals, remaining mostly on the surface but running submerged while passing within range of American patrol planes based on Johnston, Howland, and Wake Islands. But as the submarines neared Hawaiian waters, the weather worsened. On the I-22, Lieutenant Naoji Iwasa, a zealous young career officer who was to command one of the midgets, disobeyed orders requiring a lifeline for everyone topside on the rolling boat. Fearing for the safety of his midget, Iwasa ventured onto the deck to look after her and was nearly swept overboard. He was ordered by the I-boat's irate captain to remain below for the rest of the trip. The roaring seas caused abject misery for the men below. A surfaced submarine breathes by sucking air through an induction valve on its bridge. Now, as huge waves repeatedly drowned their induction valves, the submarine's engines gasped for air within the boats, and the frequent sharp changes in internal atmospheric pressures afflicted the men with agonizing earaches. At last, the storm abated, and shortly after sunset on December 6th, the 5 mother submarines gathered about 100 miles south of Pearl Harbor. Then they cautiously crept to within 10 miles of the great anchorage and deployed in a fan-shaped formation outside its mouth. After midnight they surfaced. Cloaked by darkness, the Japanese could see the glow of neon from signs on Waikiki Beach, the beam of automobile headlights moving in the hills beyond, the steady glare of landing lights at Hickam Field and John Rogers Airport. On their wireless sets, they heard the all-night jazz on Honolulu station KGMB, on whose beam the Japanese carrier planes would, a few hours later, home in. On the I-24, the midget's gyro compass was found to be broken, and though technicians worked on it frantically for 2 hours, it could not be fixed. The I-boat's commander asked the midget's skipper, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, if he wished to cancel the mission. Replied Sakamaki, "Captain, I am going ahead, on to Pearl Harbor." Around 3:30 a.m. on December 7, the 5 midget submarines began to float free of their mothers and head for the anti-submarine net guarding the harbour entrance. They were supposed to attack targets of opportunity in the interval between the first and second waves of torpedo planes from the Japanese carriers, which took up positions about 200 nautical miles north of the big island of Oahu. At 6:30 a.m. Hawaiian time, the net opened to admit the United States ship Antares, an old freighter that had been converted to target towing duty. Casually watching the Antares puff past, a helmsman on the nearby United States destroyer Ward noticed a strange object. It appeared to be a buoy, following in the Antares' wake and maintaining a steady distance. When summoned, the Ward's captain immediately identified the object as the conning tower of a submarine, in an area where submerged submarines were assumed to be hostile. Her alarm blaring, the Ward opened fire with her 4-inch guns. The intruder rolled over and vanished beneath the water. The Ward followed up with a depth charge attack that was probably unnecessary. The midget lay dead on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The Ward at 6:53 a.m. flashed a message to headquarters of the 14th Naval District. "We have attacked, fired upon and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating in the defensive sea area." At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor. The attack was still going on when the destroyer Monaghan, just north of Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, spotted the United States seaplane tender Curtis flying a signal that warned of an enemy submarine in the vicinity. Almost at once, another midget submarine launched a torpedo at the Curtis. It missed and passed on to explode against a dock. The Monaghan roared in to ram, struck the midget a glancing blow, then dropped depth charges so close that they almost blew off her own stern. The midget was finished. Later, her wrecked hull was retrieved and used as fill in the construction of a new pier at Pearl Harbor's submarine base. The bodies of Lieutenant Junior Grade Shigemi Haruno and Petty Officer Harunori Yokoyama were still entombed within. The Japanese planes finished their devastating work at 9:45 a.m. Later, the destroyers Blue, Helm, and Monaghan, the destroyer minelayers Breese and Ramsey, and the light cruiser St. Louis all reported attacking submarines outside Pearl Harbor. It is entirely likely that one of them sank the I-22's midget with Lieutenant Naoji Iwasa and Petty Officer Nahoharu Sasaki aboard. At any rate, they were never seen after leaving their mother boat. The destroyers may also have got the I-20's midget, carrying Ensign Akira Hiru and Petty Officer Yoshio Katayama. The boat vanished, and her disappearance would years later give rise to one of Pearl Harbor's most intriguing mysteries. In June 1960, Navy scuba diving trainees were practicing outside the Keehee Lagoon near Pearl Harbor. In 76 feet of water, they found a midget submarine, its coral-encrusted hull apparently undamaged, its torpedoes still in the tubes, its hatch unlatched, necessarily from the inside. The divers found not the slightest trace of the boat's one-time occupants. Almost certainly, Hiru and Katayama had left the midget through the hatch, and they might well have ascended safely to the surface. If they were still strong enough to swim a mile to shore, they may somehow have managed to mingle with Oahu's large Japanese population, and might, conceivably, have still been alive. Whatever the fate of Hiru and Katayama, one of the 10 men who embarked in midget submarines on that morning of December 7th, most certainly did survive. He was Ensign Sakamaki, who had set off with his gyro compass still out of commission. Ironically, he had been selected for the mission because, in the not unlikely event of his death, he would not be missed as much as many other officers. He was one of 8 sons, and if he died, his family would still have 7 left. As it happened, Sakamaki did not die, but he suffered a series of nightmarish experiences. Hardly had he and Petty Officer Kiyoshi Inagaki left the I-24 than their midget lost trim and began to sink, nose down. While Inagaki desperately shifted 11-pound lead ballast weights toward the stern, Sakamaki threw the boat's counter-rotating propellers into reverse and backed up to the surface. When he got there, he saw Honolulu behind him. He had been heading in the wrong direction. Correcting his course, Sakamaki worked his way back toward the harbor entrance. There, southwest of the Pearl Harbor entrance buoy, he found his way blocked by a small minesweeper, the Condor, and the ubiquitous destroyer Ward. Sakamaki tried to run between them submerged, but was depth-charged by the Ward. Although the charges missed, their concussion was so violent that Sakamaki lost consciousness. When he recovered, he saw through his periscope that the Ward was behind him. The midget's way into the harbor was presumably clear, but near the harbor's entrance, the boat struck an underwater coral reef, which lifted her bow out of the water and left her stranded. After several tries, Sakamaki backed off and started on his way again, only to hit another reef. Now Sakamaki and Inagaki crept back and forth, shifting ballast aft within the submarine. Electrolyte fumes were seeping from the tilted batteries, and both men suffered shocks as they crawled on the flooded deck. At last, the midget floated free of the reef. Inspecting the damage, Sakamaki found that the torpedo launching mechanism was broken and the tubes would no longer fire. But Kazuo Sakamaki was dauntless. His torpedoes were still in their tubes, and he decided to explode them by ramming the first enemy ship he could find. By now it was past noon, and the midget was foul with battery fumes. Both Sakamaki and Inagaki passed out from lack of oxygen, and the boat drifted out to sea. Eventually the fumes cleared and Sakamaki revived. He had no notion where he was, but when he opened the hatch that night to breathe fresh air, he saw an island not far away. Trying to make for it, he ran the midget onto an outlying coral reef. The hang-up, the third of the day, immobilized the little boat for good. Sakamaki and Inagaki tried to swim to land, which lay about a mile away. Inagaki struggled as long as he could and then went under. Sakamaki, too, seemed to be done for. Exhausted by the effort, he lost consciousness. But he was washed ashore, a full 50 miles from Pearl Harbor. There he was found by a United States Army sergeant and became the Americans' first Japanese prisoner in World War II. In sum, the midget mission against Pearl Harbor was a total loss. As for the fleet boats of the main submarine force that had sailed from Japan in high hopes of fighting a great sea battle, they fared little better than the midgets. The 14 fleet boats out of Yokosuka had been positioned in 3 tiers north of Oahu as a screen for the carrier strike force. Another 12 were arranged in 2 arcs to the south of Oahu, ready to attack American warships attempting to escape from Pearl Harbor. There they waited and waited. The day of the great Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor passed without incident for the impatient submarines. So did the next day. Not until the evening of December 8th was there a sighting. Then Commander Tsuso Inaba, in the I-6 to the north, reported seeing an aircraft carrier and 2 cruisers heading northeast. From his headquarters on the old cruiser Katori at Kwajalein, Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu, commander of the undersea fleet, ordered his submarines to pursue and sink. 8 boats took up the hunt, only to find that their quarry had a lethal sting. She was, in fact, the carrier Enterprise, and on the morning of December 10, one of her planes caught and bombed the I-170 on the surface. The Japanese submarine was so badly damaged that Commander Takashi Sano dared not submerge. That afternoon, another Enterprise plane found the I-170 and sank her with all hands. On December 14, Admiral Shimizu gave up the chase and ordered the pursuing submarines to proceed to the United States west coast to cut off any supplies and reinforcements that might be headed into the western Pacific. With that, the Pearl Harbor operation came to an end. The Japanese submarine force had lost 5 midget submarines and 1 fleet boat. It had inflicted no damage whatsoever, and its failure would have a long-lasting and insidious effect on the Imperial Navy commander's attitude toward the undersea service. The officer who later became commander of the submarine fleet, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, summed up the result. Our navy was obliged to build battleships, aircraft carriers, so the limited material was divided, and we could not build many submarines. Off the west coast of the United States, the 7 submarines that had broken off their pursuit of the Enterprise were joined by 2 others, and as they gazed shoreward, the bemused submariners found themselves feeling very much like tourists. "I have never been to America," Captain Hiroshi Imazato, a division commander, told fellow officers on the bridge of the I-75. "If we were not at war, this would be an excellent chance to pass in through the Golden Gate and visit that famous city of San Francisco." Off Long Beach, California, crewmen on another I-boat saw, with mixed scorn and envy, Americans relaxing under colorful beach umbrellas, just as if there were no war going on. During the submarine's brief stay, the I-77 claimed 2 merchant ship sinkings, and the I-21 reported 2 others. Actually, they sank 1 ship each. The I-25, under Commander Meiji Tagami, daringly pursued a cargo ship into the mouth of the Columbia River, where the merchantman went aground. By Christmas, that group of boats was ordered to report to 6th Fleet headquarters at Kwajalein. There, on January 15th, aboard his flagship, the Katori, Admiral Shimizu reviewed with subordinates the progress of the submarine war to date. Balanced against their Hawaiian losses, Japanese submarines throughout the Pacific had sunk 17 ships. But these were all merchantmen, most of them small, and to the Japanese commanders, in their preoccupation with warships, they barely counted. Vice Admiral Shimizu, recalled one officer present, was much dismayed. He would soon be even more dismayed. By the end of the month, 3 more Japanese submarines were gone. The I-160, attacking Singapore shipping traffic in Sunda Strait, was sunk by the British destroyer Jupiter. The United States submarine Gudgeon destroyed the I-173 north of Midway. The I-124, a mine layer, ventured too close to the harbour at Darwin, Australia, where she was detected and successfully depth-charged by the United States destroyer Edsall and 3 Australian corvettes. Although claims of submarine sinkings were often later found to be mistaken, there could be no doubt about this one. Allied divers actually descended and stood on the I-124's hull. By the end of February, the Japanese were ready to make another attack in United States waters. Under Commander Kozo Nishino, the I-17 returned to the California coast and surfaced well offshore on the night of February 22nd. Genji Hara, a seaman aboard the I-77, noted the beginning of the daring mission in a diary full of rare and intimate glimpses of the Japanese enlisted submariner at war. Captain Nishino told the crew of his plans. "We are now entering Santa Barbara Strait," he said. "We will lie submerged tomorrow, doing reconnaissance with our periscope. Then, tomorrow night, we will surface after dark and bombard the Elwood oil fields inside the strait." Hara was overjoyed. "We are really going to do it this time," I told myself. As a substitute gunner in case a gun crew member was injured or dead, I had to check over our deck weapon. About 30 knots of wind was blowing over the deck while we did it, and there were plenty of white caps on the waves. There was a dull half-moon with a hazy halo about it. I looked up into the sky and located Great Bear and the Northern Star. Then I tried to estimate the direction of Japan from where I stood. In that moment I hoped that if I died, the people back home would know that I-17 had reached out 4,000 miles to strike at America for them. I felt very warm and full of sentiment at that moment. The next afternoon, the 23rd of February, the submerged boat crept deep into American waters. Wrote Hara, I-17 changed course and at a slow pace began navigating blindly through Santa Barbara Strait, not even showing her periscope for fear of making a telltale spray. I tried to calm down by reading a book, but could not. I had finally decided to try to eat something to distract my mind when the word was passed, "All hands to battle stations." At about 5:40 p.m., Nishino ordered, "Battle surface, man the deck gun." As the boat surfaced, the gun captain and his crew went on deck. Hara remained below, but heard the men talking on deck. He wrote, "Captain Nishino kept calling out, asking the distance to land and the submarine's depth, giving instructions about the targets. He ordered that shells be fired only at oil tanks." The gunners on deck began firing, and the crewmen below could only listen and imagine what it was like above from the sounds and shocks that came through the hull. 1, 2, 3. We could imagine the gunners loading each of those rounds, the trainer and the pointer trying to sight on the target. We had counted up to 17 when the shooting suddenly stopped. Petty Officer Homer and I had the radio watch. We spun our receiver dials, trying to find some indication of American reaction. There was none. We heard no alarm or call for help. The California radio station programs continued as leisurely as before. Gunners dropped through the hatch and I-17 began picking up speed. Two of the crew, Onodera and Nagata, came into the radio room. Nagata said it was beautiful and that he could see automobile headlights. The navigator came into the radio room then. "We started shelling right after sunset," he said. "There was no reply until we started speeding away. Some enemy planes dropped flares, but they were far from our position. The reaction set in then. 'We are the first to bombard America,' everybody began telling one another. 'Even if we don't hit a thing, they know I-17 has been here.' All of us felt like heroes. They were. And yet, as would happen time and again to the Japanese submarine force, the adventure had been essentially useless. The Elwood oil field, 12 miles north of Santa Barbara, was only slightly damaged, and its workers missed not a day's production. The incident may have been the cause of a bad case of jitters among the anti-aircraft gunners in the Los Angeles area. The next night they fired off 1,400 rounds of ammunition at illusory airplanes. But wartime censorship kept the Elwood attack out of the papers, and there was no real civilian panic. By the end of March 1942, the Japanese had occupied Sumatra in a stunning advance, and the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was for all practical purposes complete, in half the time originally estimated by the Japanese commanders. Since events had outstripped plans, most Japanese warships were recalled to the home islands for refit, while preparations were being made for the war's next phase. In spite of all the dazzling successes, Admiral Yamamoto was disturbed. Early in 1942, the United States showed unexpected signs of coming back from its catastrophe at Pearl Harbor. First, Admiral William Halsey ordered carrier strikes against the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Then, on April 18, B-25s under Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle bombed Tokyo after a daring takeoff from the carrier Hornet, and in early May, United States warships checked Japanese expansion in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yamamoto urgently wished to lure the United States fleet into the single decisive battle while there was yet time. His gaze fell upon Midway, the outermost island of the Hawaiian chain, and only 3,200 miles from San Francisco. The Japanese bombers could use the strategic speck of land as a base. Surely, Yamamoto thought, an invasion of Midway would draw out the American fleet for annihilation. The date was set for early June. Preliminary to the Great Battle, Japanese submarines would deploy in far-flung picket lines to give warning of the United States fleet's approach. Inexplicably, however, that crucial assignment was given to Submarine Squadron 5, a second-line unit under Rear Admiral Tadashige Daigo. This force was made up of obsolescent I-boats, each of them at least a dozen years old, and already scheduled for retirement to training service. At least one Navy staff officer, Commander Shojiro Lura, protested the choice to Yamamoto's chief of staff. "Those submarines," he said, "are too old and too slow for that mission. I think the combined fleet staff officers are taking too much for granted when they station such a worn-out group of submarines in the path the Americans are most likely to use." Ura was overruled, and his worst fears were soon fulfilled. Submarine Squadron 5 was delayed in leaving Japan because of the extensive repairs required for its aged boats. Then, further delayed by a typographical error in position orders, and still 2,000 miles from Midway, the squadron stopped to refuel at Kwajalein. Thereafter, for the most part, the boats travelled submerged, lest they be seen by American planes from Midway. And it was while Submarine Squadron 5 laboured slowly toward its station that American carriers reached their positions unseen, to lie in wait for the Imperial Combined Fleet, completely upsetting Yamamoto's plan. Among the several factors that contributed to the Japanese disaster at Midway, the failure of Submarine Squadron 5 took high place. During the furious swirl of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese submarines sailed the distant peripheries in idle frustration, sighting little and sinking nothing. But in the immediate aftermath of Midway, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe in the I-168 did salvage some pride for the submarine force by scoring a spectacular victory. On the 5th of June, the day after the battle, a Japanese scouting plane reported that the United States aircraft carrier Yorktown lay badly damaged and dead in the water about 150 miles northeast of Midway. Commander Tanabe received the signal, "Submarine 168 will locate and destroy the American carrier." After running submerged for the rest of the day and on the surface through much of the night, the I-168 spotted her helpless prey about 11 miles away at 5:30 a.m. on June 6. "It was the easiest intercept a submarine commander ever made," recalled Tanabe. "My course had not changed from beginning to end." Diving to 90 feet, Tanabe cut his speed to 6 knots, then to 3. He had spotted one minesweeper with a tow line out to the Yorktown, a destroyer, the Hammond, close by her side, and 3 more patrolling the flank nearest to the I-168. Figuring that there must be at least 2 others on the carrier's far side, Tanabe calculated that he was opposed by 7 destroyers. "Our screws were barely turning over," he wrote, "and I hoped they were not giving off enough turbulence for the American ships to detect us." The United States warships detected nothing. Shortly after 11 a.m., Tanabe's sound operator reported that he could no longer hear the ping-ping of the destroyer's echo ranging. "It appears," said Tanabe, "the Americans have interrupted their war for lunch." In fact, Tanabe had crept through the destroyer screen, and the escorts were pinging on their far side, away from him. With infinite caution, Tanabe raised his periscope and saw the huge loom of the Yorktown a mere 600 yards away. The tension in I-168's conning tower had been steadily building up for 6.5 hours, Tanabe recalled. "We were all perspiring heavily. My torpedo petty officer was scanning his switch panel, and a nervous helmsman wiped clammy hands frequently on his pants. Lieutenant Junior Grade Nakagawa, pencil in hand, mopped his damp brow between looks at the compass and speed indicator. Then, to the astonishment of his colleagues, Tanabe stepped back from the periscope. "Down, periscope," he said. "Right 20 degrees rudder. Maintain full silence. Maintain speed of 3 knots. The others in the conning tower stared at Tanabe as if he were mad. "What has happened, Captain?" they asked. "Aren't we attacking?" Tanabe explained. When fired from a depth of 60 feet, his torpedoes would require time to stabilize before striking the target. "The range is too short," he said. "I am going to open the range and try again. I want to be sure of this termination." In a slow, perilous journey requiring nearly 90 minutes, Tanabe edged the I-168 to the right in a circle, returning to the boat's original track about a mile from the Yorktown. On one of many special missions performed by Japanese submarines, the I-29 Rear prepares to meet a string of rubber boats from the U-180 at a rendezvous off Madagascar in April of 1943. The boat's chief passenger was Subhas Chandar Bose, a violently anti-British Indian nationalist who was coming out of exile in Germany. Bose planned to raise an army among Indian prisoners of war in Japan and attack British colonial forces in Burma and elsewhere. But the scheme failed dismally, and Bose himself died in a plane crash in 1945. Incredibly, the destroyers had still failed to detect him. Once in place, Tanabe had a novel firing plan. "If I followed the usual procedure and fired 4 torpedoes with a 2-degree spread," he later explained, "they would cover 6 degrees. But I wanted very badly to deprive the Americans of this carrier. I intended to limit my salvo to a 2-degree spread. I would fire number 1 and number 2 first, and then send number 3 and number 4 in their wakes on the same courses. I would thus deliver all my punch into the carrier's midsection, rather than spread it out along her hull." At 1:30 p.m. Tanabe fired. Within a minute, explosions were heard, and the submarine echoed with shouts of "Cheer!" 2 of the torpedoes hit the Yorktown, and 1 hit the destroyer Hammond, taking the lives of many of her crewmen and sending the rest overboard. Soon the destroyer went down. "Go ahead at full speed," Tanabe ordered, and then, "Take her down to 200 feet." But on this day, Yahachi Tanabe was full of surprises, and instead of fleeing, he soon shook his officers by ordering the boat slowed almost to a standstill in what he considered the perfect hiding place. "By that time," Tanabe recalled, "we were where I wanted to be, directly beneath the enemy carrier. I did not think she would sink at once, so had no fear of her coming down on us. There would be men in the water. Her destroyers would not risk dropping depth charges for a while, for fear of eliminating their comrades." It was a brilliant idea, but it failed. The crewmen of the Yorktown stayed aboard, and the destroyers quickly began depth charging for all they were worth. The I-168, driven from her shelter, wriggled and squirmed for her life for the next 2 hours. At last, around sunset, more than 12 hours after the boat had submerged, she shook free from her tormentors. And 12 hours later, the Yorktown finally sank, taking 81 officers and men down with her. It was a hallmark of Japanese submariners that they clung to large dreams, even though they could translate each one into only a small reality. Shortly after Midway, with all its discouragements, they returned to the dream of attacking the continental United States, this time using a single submarine to launch a plane flown by a warrant flying officer and his observer. By the start of the war, 11 Japanese I-boats had been fitted out to carry, in deck hangars, a single-engine catapult-launched plane, capable of flying for 3 hours at up to 100 knots. While its mother submarine was in transit, the plane was stored in 12 separate parts that could be quickly assembled for flight. Called Getter after the Japanese wooden clogs whose shape its floats resembled, the plane was meant to extend a submarine's reconnaissance range. But Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita, a farm boy who had been conscripted into the Navy and subsequently spent 9 pre-war years as a pilot, had an idea for putting the Getter to more lethal use. Shortly after the beginning of the war, while serving as a Getter pilot on the I-25, Fujita took his plan to the boat's executive officer. "If our planes were armed with bombs," he said, "they could not only locate enemy ships for I-25, but also join in attacks to sink them." The executive officer was enthusiastic and urged Fujita to put his scheme on paper to be forwarded to higher command. Fujita complied. and there the matter seemingly rested until July 27, when the I-25, which had just returned to Yokosuka, received a message. Warrant Officer Fujita is instructed to report to Imperial Naval Headquarters at once. When he arrived at that August headquarters, Fujita was ushered into the office of Commander Yura, who was waiting there with another man dressed in the uniform of a Navy commander. Fujita was stunned to recognize the officer as Prince Takamatsu, younger brother of the Japanese emperor. "Fujita," said Yura, "we are going to have you bomb the American mainland." At that point, another officer entered the room and spread charts on a table. Recalled Fujita. He ran his finger along the American coastline, stopping at a point just inland of the coast and about 75 miles north of the California border. "You will bomb forests for us," he said, "right about here." I was dumbfounded. Even a cadet pilot could bomb a forest. What did they want me for? The aide read my disappointment, for he began to speak more rapidly. The northwestern United States is full of forests. Once a blaze gets started in the deep woods, it is very difficult to stop. Sometimes whole towns are destroyed. If we were to bomb some of these forests, it would put the enemy to much trouble. It might even cause large-scale panic. The mission went forward. Fujita spent weeks training and studying for his momentous task. Then came his long, slow journey to American waters in the submarine Y-25. Fujita was cleaning his pistol at 4 o'clock on the morning of September 9, 1942, when a messenger ordered him to report to the I-25's skipper, Meiji Tagami, in the conning tower. There, nodding at the periscope, Tagami said, "Take a look, Fujita, and tell me what you think." Recalled Fujita, "I grasped the periscope's handles and peered through its eyepiece at the coast of Oregon, its inland mountains wreathed by haze. I could make out the white face of Cape Blanco and could see its lighthouse flashing in the twilight. The waves, so high for the past 10 days, had flattened out. The sky was clear too." "Captain," I said, "it looks good. I think we can do it today." Once again, the preparations for a Japanese submarine mission were more exciting than the mission itself. The brave Fujita and his observer, Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, did fly 50 miles inland. They did drop 2 bombs on Oregon's forests. They did return in the best of health. "Mission is completed, sir," Fujita reported back to the commander of the submarine. "Both bombs exploded perfectly. 2 large fires are spreading." In fact, Oregon had recently been saturated by heavy rains, and Fujita's fires quickly burned themselves out. Little damage was done, and the American populace did not panic. Fujita's exploit had been a symbolic success, but a practical waste of a submarine. The I-25 could have been employed to much better effect in the Solomon Islands, where a crisis had meanwhile developed that would permanently change the major mission of the Japanese submarine force. On August 15, 1942, when the I-25 left for the Oregon coast, other Japanese submarines were scattered far and wide. Some were operating off Australia, others in the Aleutians, some in the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. So widespread was the deployment that only 2 submarines, both of them RO-class coastal boats, were in the Solomons area when, on August 7, the United States Navy began landing 11,000 Marines on the malarial island of Guadalcanal. Taken by surprise, the Imperial Navy reacted swiftly and furiously. By August 24, no fewer than 13 more submarines had been rushed to the Solomons, along with strong surface forces. On that day, shortly after 8 a.m., the I-123 was patrolling in Indispensable Strait, between the eastern end of Guadalcanal and the island of Malaita, when she was spotted by the old United States destroyer Gamble, which had been converted into a mine layer. The Gamble depth-charged the I-123 for nearly 4 hours and destroyed her and her crew. Japanese submariners soon took revenge in full and with interest. On the afternoon of September 15th, Commander Takaichi Kinashi, already one of Japan's submarine aces with 6 ships totaling about 40,000 tons to his credit, was in the I-19 in the waters of the Solomon Islands. Raising his periscope to reconnoiter his surroundings, Kinashi was awestruck. There were so many American warships within reach of his torpedoes, 23 altogether, that he could not see them all at once. There was the carrier Wasp, with cruisers and destroyers in escort. Beyond the Wasp was the carrier Hornet, accompanied by the new battleship North Carolina and other escorts. Given the range and the crowd, Kinashi could hardly miss. He fired 6 torpedoes. 3 smashed into the Wasp so violently that aircraft were hurled from her flight deck. 3 others sped past the Wasp and the Hornets group, exploding against the North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien. In the confusion, Kinashi's I-19 easily escaped. 6 hours and 15 minutes later, the Wasp, her fires out of control, went under. Although the sturdy North Carolina was saved, she was put out of the war for 2 months. The O'Brien was given temporary repairs and sent limping back to the United States, but her back had been broken and she finally sank between New Caledonia and California. For another 2 months, savage battles raged ashore and on the sea's surface for control of Guadalcanal, with the submarines of both sides playing only a minor part. But by mid-November, it was clear that the Americans were on Guadalcanal to stay, and the Japanese problem became one of keeping 15,000 troops alive until they could be extricated. On November 16, Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, who had succeeded to the command of the 6th Fleet, held a conference at Truk and announced that submarines henceforth would carry provisions to Guadalcanal. The junior submariners were aghast. "How," asked one, "can submarines carry out their foremost mission, attack when we are forced into this stupid work?" Finally, Komatsu held up his hand for silence. The troops on Guadalcanal, he said, were starving. "We must help them," he insisted, "no matter what sacrifices must be made." So began an enterprise that would preoccupy most of the Japanese submarine force until the end of the war. Supply operations expanded almost immediately from Guadalcanal to include beleaguered troops on New Guinea and other islands, and eventually reached a point where there were more boats on supply missions than on war patrols. It was dangerous and dirty night work. The submariners contemptuously referred to it as Operation Magura, or Mole. By early 1943, as many as 17 Japanese submarines were relegated either full or part-time to Magura. Submarines were so valuable for this unsubmarinely task that even the Japanese army was quietly getting into the business of building boats for supply duty. Japan's wartime Prime Minister and Minister of War, General Hideki Tojo, tried to keep the secret. "If the Navy learns of Army plans to build submarines," Tojo told an associate, "it will surely oppose them, so don't tell the Navy." The Navy not only found out, but cordially loaned the Army several technicians to help in the project. All told, some 50 Army submarines were constructed, but they went to waste. Only 3 actually saw service, running supplies to the Philippines in late 1944. As for the Navy's Magura, its techniques were at first both imaginative and crude. A major difficulty lay in landing supplies under the constant threat of attack by American aircraft and warships. In the early attempts, provisions were placed inside rubber bags, which in turn were encased in wooden cylinders to be fired ashore from submarine torpedo tubes. The containers blew up, strewing supplies across large tracts of water. More practical methods were soon developed. One employed the stores carrying tube, a 130-foot-long cylinder with ballast tanks at each end. When filled with supplies, the stores carrying tube had a capacity of 337 tons. Towed into shallow water by a submarine, it was then cast loose and retrieved by soldiers who waded out to haul it ashore. More sophisticated was the cannon carrier, so called since it was sometimes used to land artillery pieces. The cannon carrier was a raft 71 feet long and 13 feet wide that was floated on 2 cylinders and propelled by the power plants of 2 torpedoes. Like the stores carrying tube, the cannon carrier was towed to the landing site. From there it was driven ashore by a pilot from the submarine. While flirting with fate in enemy-controlled waters, the Magura boats suffered high casualties. On December 9, 1942, with the operation barely begun, the Ep.3, under Commander Ichiro Togami, was caught and sunk by an American torpedo boat off Cape Esperance. On December 20, near Simpson Harbor, New Britain, Lieutenant Commander Toshitake Ueno's I-4 was sighted by the United States submarine Sea Dragon, which fired 4 torpedoes and sank the Japanese boat. And on January 29, 1943, a wild fray put an end to the long career of the I-1, at the age of 16, the grandfather of the Japanese submarine fleet. The I-1, under Lieutenant Commander Aichi Sakamoto, appeared on the radar of a New Zealand corvette, the Kiwi. At 9 p.m., as Sakamoto was preparing to unload supplies in Guadalcanal's Coimbo Bay, the Kiwi rushed at her, firing deck guns, machine guns, and even rifles. The Kiwi rammed the I-1, and then, during a battle at close quarters, rammed her twice more. Somehow the boat remained afloat. Then the Kiwi's sister ship, the Moa, joined the brawl, and she too rammed the I-17. During the struggle, Sakamoto was mortally wounded, and 30 Japanese seamen were dead. But the I-1 did not go down. Her executive officer, Lieutenant Sadayoshi Kurida, finally disengaged the boat, ran her onto the beach, and escaped with about 50 survivors. A few, Kurida among them, joined Japanese soldiers and spent the rest of the war in the fetid jungle of Guadalcanal. The war in the Pacific, wrote submariner Zenji Orita, was truly developing into a hellish one for our Sixth Fleet. And while those on supply missions might call themselves moles, those on war patrols thought of themselves as Nezumi, or rats. With their radar, Orita recalled, the American destroyers were like cats in the dark, ready to pounce, and the rats had to elude them. In November of 1943, the fate of a 9-submarine Japanese patrol east of the Gilbert Islands more than proved Orita's point. By October, Japanese naval commanders had heavily fortified the Gilberts, suspecting quite correctly that the island group was a target for imminent invasion. And in mid-November, 9 submarines were sent out on a scouting expedition. For about 5 weeks, all seemed placid. Then, on November 20th, the waters of the Gilberts suddenly teemed with American warships in overwhelming strength, and United States Marines were landed on Betio, an island at the southern end of the Tarawa Atoll. After that, the reports from the submarines to Japanese Sixth Fleet headquarters came thick and fast for a while, and then sickeningly slowed and almost stopped. On November 22, Lieutenant Commander Hideo Yamamoto in the I-35 sent a wireless message. Yesterday, I-35 pierced the enemy screen and got within sight of Tarawa, sighted large enemy task force and tried to approach it, but was intercepted by aircraft and had to dive. Yamamoto was never heard from again. The I-35 had been detected by sonar on the United States destroyer Meade. With the destroyer Fraser's help, the Meade depth-charged the I-35 to the surface and eliminated her with gunfire. That same day, the I-19, the submarine that had sunk the Wasp, radioed headquarters that she expected to arrive within 30 miles of Tarawa within 48 hours. That was the I-19's last message. She was picked up on radar and depth-charged to destruction by the destroyer Radford. Other boats were heard from once and then no more. On November 25, just after Japanese land forces had been annihilated on Betio, Lieutenant Commander Makio Tanaka in the I-39 reported that he was 60 miles southwest of Tarawa and had attacked enemy ships. Then silence. On November 27, the I-21's commander, Hiroshi Inada, reported that he was 30 miles southwest of Tarawa and enemy warships were in sight. Silence. Neither the I-40 nor the RO-38 answered a general call to report on December 3rd. The Radford had sunk the I-40. Thus, out of the 9 submarines that had gone on patrol to the Gilberts, only 3 survived. The Gilberts' debacle, combined with Operation Mogura's continuing drudgery, had an extraordinary aftermath. Skippers of the 3 surviving submarines complained bitterly and openly. "I am positive," said Lieutenant Commander Nobukio Nambu of the I-174, that all the submarines lost went down without even getting a chance to attack the enemy. The I-169 and the I-175, which had also survived, had received insufficient rest from previous patrols, and as a result their crews were exhausted. As for RO-38, he continued, she was fresh from home waters, with an inexperienced crew that still needed lots of training. Added Lieutenant Commander Zenshin Toyama of the I-169 and Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata of the I-175, Sixth Fleet Headquarters required reports from us too often, again making for easy discovery through radio detection. Tabata, however, had scored a big hit in the Gilberts operation. On November 24, the I-175 sank the United States escort carrier Liscombe Bay off Makin Island, with a loss of 644 American lives. In January of 1944, a nearly mutinous protest came from an officer who had merely heard of the Gilbert's fiasco. He was Zenji Orita, by now a lieutenant commander and the skipper of the I-177. Orita stated his case aboard the Katori, facing the latest fleet commander, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, and his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Hisao Mito. "As all here know," said Orita, "using submarines for transport is throwing away the reason for their construction." His men, he continued, were eager to fight, but not to lug around crates of supplies. Admiral Takagi tried to soothe Orita, then stood up to signal the end of the meeting. "Admiral," said Orita, "I have other things I would like to add." Takagi sat down. Among other things, Orita criticized the continuing deployment of submarines in sentry lines. When the enemy detected one boat in a line, he said, he can detect the others even more easily. Thus, all are endangered by one. Admiral Mito interrupted. Japan's situation, he said, was such that sometimes we have to send our submarines out when there is not even a 50-50 chance of their returning. Orita, furious, pounded the table. "All submariners are willing to give their lives at sea," he cried. "What we expect of you and your staff is that you keep that 50% chance in mind. Otherwise, we will lose all of our boats." Admiral Takagi brought the astounding session to a close. Orita's views, he said, reflected a negative attitude. No matter what the difference may be between our capability and that of the enemy, we must still carry out our orders, mustn't we? This has always been the battle spirit of Japanese submarine men, has it not? Orita, utterly defeated, shut up. But his negative attitude about picket lines was, all too soon, to be proved devastatingly correct. Early in 1944, the American forces in the Central Pacific were on the prowl, beginning with the seizure of the Marshall Islands in January and February. Then carrier forces went after the Japanese fleet at Truk and the Palaus, and in April, to General MacArthur's aid in his invasion of Hollandia on the north coast of New Guinea. Now they were ready to move on the Marianas. By May 16th, Japanese submarines were in place off the Marianas as always. They were deployed in a picket line. On May 19, the United States destroyer escort England, patrolling with the destroyer escorts George and Raby, followed up an American plane's report of sighting a submarine. The England found, attacked and destroyed the I-16. By now well aware of Japanese tactical deployment, the three warships swung west, seeking the next submarine in the line. They missed the I-144, but continued on their way and found the Row-106. The England sank her. Next in line was the Row-104, which eluded the destroyers for what was left of the day. They found her the next day, and the England got her. Missing the Row-105, the destroyers eliminated the Row-116, and 48 hours later, the Row-108. On May 31, the RO-105 went down. Within 12 days, by the relatively simple procedure of rolling up a picket line, the England's group had sunk 6 Japanese submarines. The Japanese were now engaged in a desperate war of defense, and their submarine force reflected that bitter reality. 18 boats of the RO-100 class, capable of a top surface speed of 14.5 knots and able to do only 8 knots while submerged, were built as part of the Navy's replenishment program for the defense of island shorelines. 2 even slower boats, at least while submerged, were the I-351 class submarines, which crept beneath the water at a snail's pace 6.3 knots. Carrying 370 tons of gasoline in addition to their own diesel fuel requirements, the I-357s had been designed as undersea tankers to supply distant submarine bases. In the event, however, they were used as seaplane tenders. Toward the end of the war, the Japanese gained the distinction of producing the world's fastest submersible. Modelled after the German Type 21 U-boat and further refined, the I-201 class attack submarines had highly streamlined hulls, a narrow 12-to-1 length-to-beam ratio, improved diesels, and enormously powerful electric motors that could drive the boat for 55 minutes at a fantastic 19 knots underwater. 23 were ordered, but only 3 were actually completed, and they were commissioned too late in the war to have any effect. There is no record of their ever having sunk a ship. As far back as 1942, wonderful plans had been made for building giant I-400 class submarines, more than 400 feet long and displacing upward of 5,000 tons. These boats would carry 2 or perhaps 3 aircraft and span the globe, attacking New York, Washington, and other ports on the east coast of the United States. Those hopes were later reduced to a scheme for blockading the Panama Canal, and in fact, when 2 of the monsters were completed, they too were used for routine supply duty. At one point in 1944, there was a plan brewing to convert existing I-boats to transport amphibious vehicles piggyback from Cure to Bougainville. The amphibians, equipped with tracks, were supposed to crawl over coral reefs into lagoons and attack enemy ships with incredibly torpedoes. The plan died in embryo. Much more practical and infinitely more sinister were the 2 transport submarines of the new I-361 class, which had been completed by the late summer of 1944. These could carry 85 tons of supplies, 100 men, and 2 small craft to land them. But they were adapted to a grim use, the very use Admiral Yamamoto had been determined to avoid when he authorized the deployment of midget submarines at Pearl Harbor. In less than 3 years, Japan had been so reduced in fortune that it was prepared to send men to their deaths by self-annihilation. The macabre idea was born in the minds of 2 young midget submarine pilots, Lieutenant Junior Grade Hiroshi Kuroki and Lieutenant Junior Grade Sekio Nishina. They began drawing plans for a tiny pilot's compartment with controls, a seat and a periscope to be inserted between the warhead and the power plant of a Model 93 torpedo, surface sister to the submarine's Model 95. When transported to the target area on an I-boat, the lethal little submarine would be cast free to inflict death at the cost of the pilot's life. Kuroki and Nishina called the weapon a Kaiton, literally sky change, and by extension, the agent of change in Japan's fortunes. When the Kaiton plan was submitted early in the war, it was flatly rejected by the Navy's command. Kuroki and Nishina persisted. Finally, to impress their superiors with their sincerity, they observed the honored tradition of writing a petition in their own blood. In late 1943, upon receipt of the petition, the Imperial Japanese Navy accepted the submarine as a self-annihilating weapon. In the summer of 1944, a Kaiton base was established on Otsujima, an island in Japan's inland sea, with several dozen young trainees who were prepared to die for their country. They would be followed by many more. There was never a dearth of volunteers, either for the Kaiton or for its airborne equivalent, the self-annihilating special duty program, which was established 2 months later. The chief instructors at the Otsujima base were, appropriately, Hiroshi Kuroki and Sekio Nishina. But on the 6th of September, Kuroki, whose dream of glory would send other young men to death, met his own inglorious end when his controls jammed. Practicing in a Kaiton designed to hold 2 men, Kuroki and a trainee, Lieutenant Takashi Higuchi, lost control and plunged to the bottom. There their submarine broke open, drowning them both. On November 8, 1944, the I-47, commanded by Zenji Orita, the man who had stood up to Fleet Commander Takagi and his Chief of Staff, departed from Otsujima on the first Kaiton mission. The submarine's destination was the Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands, with its enormous deep-water lagoon. Ulithi had been occupied by the Americans without a fight in September 1944, and was now being used as a major forward anchorage by the United States Pacific Fleet. On their voyage, the 4 Kaiton pilots on the I-47 studied recognition silhouettes of enemy ships, played chess, and teased one of their number, a young lieutenant, junior grade, named Hitoshi Fukuda, who was so shy that he suffered through his first full day at sea rather than ask how to work the submarine's rather complicated toilet. At noon on November 19, Orita raised his periscope just outside Ulithi's reef. He saw the lagoon dotted with dozens of American warships of every description. Said Orita, "We will launch Kaiton in the morning." That evening, recalled Orita, a fine sake, a gift from the Emperor, was served in specially prepared lacquerware cups. Then the pilots retired to get what rest they could. I waited until 90 minutes after sunset, then took I-47 to the surface. At a speed of 12 knots, I approached Ulithi. There was no need to take a star sight. The atoll sky was bright, like coastal cities in peacetime. I told myself that the presence of all those lights meant the enemy had no idea we were anywhere near. By 4 o'clock on the morning of November 20th, the 4 pilots had entered their Kaiton. One of them was none other than Sekio Nishina, who had with him an urn containing the ashes of his co-inventor, Hiroshi Kuroki. At 4:15 a.m., Orita gave the command, "Go!" Nishina's Kaiton slid off the I-47's deck and disappeared. By 4:30 a.m., all 4 Kaiton were in the water. On the bridge of the I-47, Orita and others waited tensely. At 5:07 a.m., a huge burst of light within the harbour was followed in seconds by the sound of an explosion. 4 minutes later, there was still another explosion. For the I-47, it was time to leave. Orita took the boat down and headed north, away from the first Kaiton attacks. Returning to Kure, the I-47 was credited with an aircraft carrier and a battleship. In fact, only a United States fleet oiler had been destroyed. The other 3 Kaiton were either sunk by United States defenders or were otherwise wrecked. So far as is known, there was only one other victim of the Kaiton during the war. A human torpedo from the I-53 blew off the bow of the United States destroyer escort Underhill on July 24, 1945, in the Philippine Sea, damaging her so badly that she had to be sunk. The cost of the Kaiton program to the Japanese was heavy. 80 pilots lost on sorties and another 16 in training. For Japanese submariners, the war was all but over. By 1945, only a dozen or so submarines remained fit for combat service. Among them, with Kaiton aboard, was the I-58 under Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, a veteran who had been a torpedo officer on one of the I-boats carrying midgets to Pearl Harbor. On the night of July 29, 1945, at about 11 o'clock, the I-58 and Hashimoto, 11 days out of Kura, were on the surface between Guam and Leyte when a dark mass was sighted on the horizon. Hashimoto went to periscope depth, then submerged fully. "All tubes to the ready," he ordered, and then Kaiton stand by. The dark shape grew larger and larger. "It was still making straight for us," recalled Hashimoto. "At this rate it would pass right over us." By now, the Kaiton pilots were begging Hashimoto to surface so that they might enter their craft. But Hashimoto was having none of it. He had Model 95 torpedoes in his tubes, and he was determined to use them as a captain should. "Stand by," ordered Hashimoto. "Fire!" 6 torpedoes were launched and sped from the forward tubes. Hashimoto waited. "Every minute seemed an age," he wrote later. Then on the starboard side of the enemy by the forward turret, and then by the after turret, there rose columns of water, to be followed immediately by flashes of bright red flame. Then another column of water rose from alongside No. 2 turret and seemed to envelop the whole ship. "A hit! A hit!" I shouted as each torpedo struck home, and the crew danced round with joy. The I-58 had dealt mortal blows to the United States heavy cruiser Indianapolis as she headed unescorted toward the Philippines. 2 Japanese torpedoes had hit her, and the secondary explosions that followed ripped the ship wide open. Internal communications were knocked out immediately, and all fire mains burst. The crippled ship ploughed on, scooping up tons of water that hastened her sinking. The commander of the Indianapolis, Captain Charles Butler Ep.3, ordered a distress call sent, but no ship or shore station ever received his SOS. Less than 15 minutes after being hit, the Indianapolis went down, bow first. Hundreds of stunned, badly burned sailors leaped into the oil-streaked, shark-filled water wearing life jackets, but with only 12 rafts and 6 large rescue nets among them. For the survivors, the real ordeal lay ahead. One day passed, and then another and another. The sailors, burning with thirst, fired flares and watched in anguish as army planes streamed by overhead without noticing them. They watched their mates die. Some men began to hallucinate. "Here comes a Japanese. He is trying to take my life. Help!" shouted a sailor on one raft. He began swinging wildly. He kept punching thin air until his mates subdued him. More than 80 hours after the sinking, a twin-engine Ventura, flying by chance in the area, spotted an oil slick. The plane swooped low to investigate, and the pilot saw the men in life rafts. After dropping some gear to the desperate men, the pilot sent a radio message that started one of the largest rescue operations in history. Ships and planes swarmed to the area and picked up 316 survivors. But some 400 men of the Indianapolis had been dead in the torpedo blast, and about 500 more had died in the water. The Japanese submariners who had sunk the Indianapolis did not know the identity of their victim. The cruiser was so big they thought they had sent down an Idaho-class battleship. In any case, the victory was a magnificent one,